The night Kelechi Okafor decided to end his marriage, he did not choose honesty, kindness, or privacy. He chose spectacle. He chose bright lights, expensive glassware, a room full of important people, and a microphone. He chose to embarrass his wife in front of the same city she had spent years helping him impress. And in the moment he raised his glass and smiled for the cameras, he truly believed he was stepping into a better life. What Kelechi did not know was that before the next sunset, the woman he had dismissed so casually would be standing at the center of a room far more powerful than the one he had used to shame her. And this time, she would not be introduced as anyone's wife. She would be introduced by her own name. If you like my video, please subscribe my YouTube channel. The ballroom at the Harbor Crown Hotel in Lagos glittered like money trying to prove a point. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters in black vests drifted between round tables carrying trays of drinks no one really needed, but everyone accepted because that was what people did at events like this. At one end of the room, a string quartet played softly enough not to interrupt conversation, but elegantly enough to remind everyone that the evening was important. Outside, traffic groaned along the expressway. Horns rose and fell in the night. Somewhere beyond the guarded entrance, a food seller fanned smoke over roasting suya, and the smell floated faintly through the warm air whenever the ballroom doors opened. Inside, everything was controlled, curated, prestigious. It was supposed to be a celebration. Kelechi Okafor, regional director at one of the fastest-growing commercial banks in the country, was receiving a leadership recognition award that night. Newspapers had already mentioned it. Business blogs had posted about it. The event had become less about the award itself and more about what it represented: momentum, visibility, arrival. And standing beside all of it, as she had stood beside everything else in his life for 7 years, was his wife, Amara. Amara Okafor wore a deep emerald gown with long sleeves and a narrow waist. The fabric moved softly around her legs when she walked. Her hair was braided and pinned low at the back of her head, simple and elegant, the kind of style that did not beg to be noticed, and yet was impossible to ignore once you looked at it properly. A pair of gold earrings rested against her neck. Her makeup was light, her posture was steady. She had helped organize much of the evening without allowing anyone to know how much she had done. She had called in favors, confirmed guests, reminded Kelechi about names he should remember, corrected an error in the printed program, and personally spoken to the event coordinator when the seating chart accidentally placed a state commissioner beside a man he openly disliked. She had done what she had always done. She had made things smoother. To most people in the room, Amara looked like what successful men were expected to have beside them: a beautiful, calm wife who smiled at the right people and never demanded attention. What most people did not know was that Amara had once had her own plans that were large enough to frighten her. At 32, she worked as a literacy program manager for a non-profit that built community reading centers in underserved areas. She loved her work in the quiet, serious way people love the things that still feel true even after life has disappointed them elsewhere. She believed in books, in classrooms, in clean desks, in girls who raised their hands, in boys who needed someone to tell them gentleness was not weakness. She believed in second chances, though that belief had grown thinner over the years. She and Kelechi had been married for 7 years. For the first 2, she had called them happy. For the next 3, she had called them manageable. For the last 2, she had called them what they were only in the privacy of her own mind: lonely. Not dramatic loneliness, not loud loneliness, the quieter kind. The kind that sat at the dining table across from you while your husband answered emails. The kind that went to weddings, funerals, office parties, and church services beside a man who still remembered to hold your elbow, but no longer looked at your face when you spoke. The kind that kept itself neat and presentable because nobody rewards women for collapsing on schedule. Still, Amara had worn green that night because Kelechi once told her it made her look unforgettable. Still, she had arrived on his arm. Still, she had hoped. Hope was a habit she had not fully broken. At 8:30, the event host tapped the microphone and began the final segment of the evening. A few speeches had already been made. A former minister had praised visionary leadership in Africa. A board member had spoken at length and said almost nothing. Laughter had risen, died, and risen again in the practiced rhythm of wealthy rooms. Now it was Kelechi's turn. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the stage to applause. Amara clapped too. Why wouldn't she? That was her husband. He took the microphone with the smooth confidence of a man who had spent years learning the power of appearing comfortable under light. He thanked the organizers. He thanked his colleagues. He thanked his mentors. He thanked God. He thanked persistence, sacrifice, excellence, teamwork, and vision. The usual things. People nodded, glasses lifted. Someone at the back murmured approval. A photographer crouched slightly to capture his best angle. Amara watched him and thought, for a moment, that perhaps the evening would remain ordinary after all. Then Kelechi paused. It was a small pause, but it had intention inside it. He smiled, but not toward her. Instead, he turned slightly toward the front row where a woman in a fitted cream dress sat with one leg crossed over the other, her lipstick perfect, her expression composed in a way that suggested she had been expecting a moment. Amara knew her. Her name was Sade Afolayan. She had met her twice before at bank functions, once in passing, once over lunch when Kelechi described her as brilliant, ambitious, and invaluable to the expansion team. Amara had noticed then how Sade laughed with her whole mouth when Kelechi spoke. She had noticed the ease between them. She had noticed the way women notice danger long before they allow themselves to call it by name. Now Sade looked up at the stage, and Kelechi's smile changed. Not wider, softer, more private. Amara felt something in her stomach go cold. "There's one person," Kelechi said, "I haven't thanked yet." A few heads turned. She came into my life at a time when I was forced to admit something difficult to myself. That success means nothing if you're living a life that no longer feels honest. The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Amara stopped clapping. Kelechi kept speaking. For a long time, I stayed in situations because they were familiar, because they looked right from the outside, because I didn't want to disappoint people. A woman at the next table glanced at Amara and then immediately away. "I think many of us do that," Kelechi continued. "We settle into roles that no longer fit us. We keep performing a version of ourselves that has already expired." There it was. Not yet the knife, but the sound of it leaving the table. Amara stood very still. The quartet had gone silent. The room was listening now with the intense politeness of people sensing scandal and trying not to appear eager for it. Kelechi looked directly at Sade. "Tonight, I want to thank the woman who reminded me what it feels like to be seen clearly." The ballroom stopped pretending. There are moments when humiliation arrives in stages. First, confusion, then dread, then the sickening understanding that what is happening is actually happening, and that no one can save you from the fact that others are witnessing it too. Amara felt all three in the space of a breath. Sade rose slowly from her chair, not startled, not reluctant, prepared. She walked toward the stage in heels that clicked cleanly across the floor. A murmur moved through the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Someone coughed. Someone whispered, "Jesus." Someone else reached for a phone and then thought better of it. Kelechi extended a hand to Sade and helped her onto the stage. Amara did not move. She could hear her own heartbeat now. Not fast, heavy, like something knocking from behind a locked door. Kelechi, one of his senior colleagues, said under his breath from a nearby table, but Kelechi ignored him. He placed his hand at the small of Sade's back and faced the room. "I believe everyone deserves the truth," he said, "so let me stop living halfway. My marriage has been over in every way that matters for a long time." A sharp inhale moved across the room. "I intend to begin a new chapter. With Sade." Silence. Not empty silence. Crushed silence. The violent kind. Then, as always, whispers. Amara heard none of the details. She only saw mouths moving, eyebrows lifting, eyes darting toward her and away. The entire ballroom had become one large face trying not to stare directly at pain. Kelechi turned toward her at last. It would have been kinder if he had looked ashamed. He did not. "Amara," he said into the microphone, as though addressing an audience and a subordinate at the same time. "You are a good woman, but we both know this marriage has not been alive for a long time. I think it is better to stop pretending. Good woman. As if goodness were compensation. As if dignity were a consolation prize given to the person being publicly discarded." Amara felt the heat of 200 eyes. She thought of the ironed shirt she had laid out for him that morning. She thought of the speech draft she had helped shorten because his original version rambled. She thought of all the private disappointments she had swallowed whole because marriage, she had been taught, was a place where women carried pain quietly if they wanted peace to survive. Then she thought of something else. How tired she suddenly was. Not broken, tired. There is a difference. She lifted her left hand and looked at her wedding ring. A plain gold band. No dramatic stone, no attention-seeking design. Just weight. Years of it. She slid it off slowly. The room watched. She walked to the nearest table, set the ring beside a half-full glass of orange juice, and raised her face toward the stage. When she spoke, her voice was calm enough to shame the room. "Thank you," she said. Kelechi frowned slightly, not expecting that. "For showing me who you are in public," she continued. "It saves time." A few people actually looked down. Amara picked up her clutch. Then she added, "You will not have to pretend with me anymore." And with that, she turned and walked out of the ballroom. No tears, no scream, no desperate final speech to make the audience pity her. Just her heels, measured and even against polished floor, carrying her away from the performance. Behind her, the room stayed frozen. Because people know how to watch disgrace. They rarely know how to respond to grace. The night outside was warm and windy. By the time Amara stepped beneath the covered entrance of the hotel, clouds had swallowed most of the sky. The valet area shimmered with expensive cars and reflected light. Security guards stood near the curb with the blank alertness of men trained to see everything and react to nothing unless told. Amara drew one breath, then another. From inside, music started again. Not because anyone felt like dancing, but because events like that always tried to repair themselves quickly. Money hates discomfort. Prestige hates visible damage. Somewhere behind those doors, organizers would already be saying things like, "Let's move on," and "Please, let's keep the program going." Amara almost laughed. Instead, she leaned one hand against a stone pillar and stared at the driveway. Her phone was vibrating inside her clutch, again and again. Friends, her sister, unknown numbers, perhaps even Kalechi, though she doubted he would call so soon. Men who humiliate publicly often need a little time before they remember consequences privately. She did not answer. Lightning flashed in the distance. Then rain came down all at once, hard and loud, bouncing off the pavement, blurring headlights, sending drivers into hurried motion. Hotel attendants rushed to help guests from their cars with umbrellas. The city beyond the gate shimmered silver and gold in the downpour. Amara stepped farther back under the shelter and closed her eyes for one moment. When she opened them, a black SUV had just stopped beneath the awning. Not flashy, not modest either. The kind of vehicle that belonged to someone who had no need to impress strangers because his life was already evidence enough. A driver stepped out first, then another man from the passenger side, broad-shouldered, scanning the entrance area. Finally, the rear door opened. The man who emerged was tall, dark-skinned, and dressed in charcoal with no tie, only a white shirt open at the throat and a coat that sat easily on him. He moved with the unhurried precision of someone accustomed to being watched and completely uninterested in performing for it. He took 2 steps toward the entrance before his eyes landed on her. Then he stopped. Amara knew that face. Not immediately as it was, but as it had been. Younger, leaner, sunlit in memory, bent over notebooks in a university courtyard, laughing only after long pauses, as if he preferred to make sure a thing was worth laughing at before giving it the honor. Her breath caught. He said her name softly. Amara? No one had spoken her name like that in years, not as if finding her mattered. David, she said. David Adebayo stood very still in the rainlight, and for one suspended second, the hotel entrance, the scandal, the wet pavement, the entire night seemed to step backward and make room for memory. 12 years earlier, David had been the quiet engineering student who built things from scraps and sketches and stubborn belief. The young man who stayed late helping her organize literacy drives on campus because he said a country could not rise if its children only learned obedience and not thought. The man who once walked 5 kilometers with her because she was upset and he knew that if he kept her moving, she would tell the truth eventually. They had loved each other once. Not recklessly, not noisily, deeply. And then, life had separated them before love could finish becoming a future. David looked from her face to her bare left hand, then back again. He did not ask a foolish question. He did not say, "Are you okay?" in the careless way people say it when they want comfort from your answer more than honesty from your pain. Instead, he said, "You shouldn't be standing here alone." Something in Amara nearly cracked at the gentleness of that sentence. She steadied herself. "I'm not in danger," she said. "I didn't say you were." Rain hammered the driveway between them. David took one more step closer, just enough to lower his voice. "I'm here for a late meeting upstairs," he said. "But you look like someone who has had a worse evening than any meeting deserves. Have you eaten?" Amara stared at him. Then, despite herself, a small, exhausted smile touched her mouth. "No." "Good," he said. She blinked. "Good?" "Yes, because that means I can fix at least one thing tonight." He glanced back at his waiting car, then at her again. "Come with me, somewhere quiet, no crowd, no explanations unless you want to give them." Amara should have said no. A woman whose marriage had just been publicly dismantled should probably go home, lock her door, take off her earrings, and cry where no one could see. But the idea of going home alone, to the silence waiting in her apartment, felt suddenly heavier than rain. And David was standing in front of her, not as a memory or a what-if, but as a real man, with steady eyes and a voice that still sounded like refuge. So she said yes. They drove through wet Lagos streets while the city glittered through the windows. Danfo buses pushed through puddles, streetlights blurred on the glass. Men under shop awnings watched the rain with their hands in their pockets. Women sold roasted corn beneath plastic sheets. The city, as always, continued. Traffic moved, life bargained, generators hummed. Somewhere, music thudded from a roadside bar. Inside the car, no one rushed her. David asked simple things first: whether her mother was well, whether she was still working in education, whether she still drank tea too strong and too sweet when upset. She glanced at him then. "You remember that?" "I remember more than I forgot." He said it without trying to make it sound romantic. That made it worse. Or better. She could not tell yet. They stopped at a small restaurant in Victoria Island, tucked behind a row of offices. The kind of place with dim lighting, excellent pepper soup, and staff discreet enough to understand when silence was part of the order. David was clearly known there, but not as someone who demanded performance. They led them to a private corner and left them alone. Amara ordered rice and grilled fish. David ordered the same, then added tea for her without asking. She noticed. For several minutes they spoke of safe things. His mother, who had retired and now bullied everyone with kindness. Her younger brother, newly married and already overwhelmed. His company, which she knew of in the abstract, but had never followed closely, because the less she knew about the life she had not chosen years ago, the easier it had been to keep regret manageable. David Adebayo was no longer the thoughtful engineering student with ink on his fingers and impossible plans in his notebook. He had become something far larger: founder of Gridspan Energy, advisor to ministers, investor in public infrastructure. A man whose name appeared in interviews and conference banners and policy circles. One of the few people in the country who could walk into a room full of officials and businessmen and be treated not as an aspirant, but as a force. Yet sitting across from her now, he did not seem inflated by any of it, only sharpened. When the food arrived, Amara realized how hungry she was. She ate slowly at first, then properly. David waited until halfway through the meal before he said, "Tell me." Not demanding, offering. So she did. She told him about the award night, about the speech, about Sade walking to the stage, about the eyes in the room, about the ring on the table, about how her husband had turned 7 years into a public announcement and called it honesty. David set down his fork and listened without interrupting once. When she finished, he exhaled through his nose and looked away for a brief moment. Not because he was bored, but because outrage needed somewhere to go. "He did that in front of a room full of people?" he asked quietly. "Yes." David nodded once. Not a theatrical nod, a dangerous one. Then he said, "That was cruelty, not honesty." Amara looked at him. He went on. "Men like to rename their selfishness when they want applause for it." For the first time that night, Amara felt something inside her settle. Not heal, just settle. As if someone had placed the truth where it belonged. She had not imagined it. She had not been too sensitive. She had not been weak for feeling wounded. What happened to her had been wrong, and there was strange strength in hearing that stated plainly. They spoke until the restaurant had only 3 occupied tables left. They did not touch. They did not return to old confessions. They did not behave like people trying to recover youth. Instead, they behaved like 2 adults standing on opposite sides of many lost years, discovering with surprise that the bridge between them had not collapsed after all. When David dropped her at her apartment, rain still shimmered on the road. He waited until she reached her gate before the SUV pulled away. Amara stood beneath the dim security light and watched the taillights disappear into the wet dark. Then she went inside, removed her earrings, sat on the edge of her bed, and finally cried. Not because Kelechi had left, not really, but because the life she had been carrying had finally become too heavy to defend. And because, unexpectedly, in the same night she had lost one version of herself, another had looked up. The next morning came with sunlight and a headache. Amara woke after barely sleeping, her body full of that peculiar exhaustion that follows public pain. The apartment felt unfamiliar, though every object was where it had always been. The framed print above the dining table, the woven basket on the sideboard, the neat row of books near the window. Kelechi had slept elsewhere, or perhaps not at all. She did not know. She did not ask. Her phone was full. Missed calls. Messages. Voice notes. One from her older sister beginning with, "Amara, before I say anything else, breathe." One from her mother that simply said, "Call me before gossip reaches me dressed as concern." She smiled despite herself. Then she saw Kelechi's message. "We need to talk, calmly, like adults." Amara stared at it. There were many possible replies, none necessary. She set the phone down. Around noon, another message arrived. This one from David. "I have a board dinner tomorrow night for the Adebayo Foundation. We're discussing new education projects. I know the timing is terrible, so say no if you want, but I'd like you to come as my guest. I would value your mind in that room." Amara read the message 3 times. Not your company, not your presence, your mind. She had not realized how starved she had become for that kind of invitation. She replied after several minutes, "I don't know if I'm ready for people." His answer came quickly. "Then don't come for people. Come for dinner. Leave whenever you want." She laughed softly. By evening, she had said yes. The following night, she wore navy blue. Nothing dramatic. A simple dress with clean lines and low heels. She tied her braids back, applied lipstick the color of plum, and looked at herself in the mirror, not to search for beauty, but to confirm solidity. "You are still here," she told her reflection. That would have to be enough. David sent a car. The dinner was not at a hotel ballroom or a vanity event. It was held at a private residence in Ikoyi, with high walls, old trees, and the kind of quiet that belonged to money settled over generations rather than newly acquired and eager to perform. Inside, the dining room held 12 people, 2 education policy experts, a publisher, a development economist, a former school principal, a tech founder, and several foundation trustees. David introduced her simply. "This is Amara Okafor. She knows more about what children in underserved communities actually need than most people writing reports about them." Amara felt 12 eyes turned toward her. This time, they were not looking for scandal. They were looking for value. That was new. The conversation began over appetizers and continued through the main course. School retention, teacher training, rural libraries, solar power for learning centers, language access, digital equity. Within 20 minutes, Amara forgot to be self-conscious. She began speaking as she always had when the subject mattered more than her fear. Clearly, specifically, without trying to impress. She spoke about girls who walked too far to fetch water to arrive at school on time, about classrooms with no reading materials beyond old exam booklets, about children who could memorize answers and still never encounter imagination, about the difference between charity and infrastructure. People listened, actually listened. David asked her questions not to display her, but to deepen the room. By dessert, 2 trustees were taking notes. When the evening ended, an elderly woman on the foundation board touched Amara's arm and said, "You have the rare gift of speaking like someone who has been where policy lands. We need more of that." Amara thanked her, but inside, something larger was happening. A door she had quietly nailed shut years earlier was beginning to open. Outside, in the garden lit by small lanterns, David walked her toward the car. "You were right in your element tonight," he said. "I was distracted enough to forget my life is on fire." "That can be useful for an evening," he said. She smiled. Then, after a pause, she asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since they met again. "Why didn't you marry?" David looked toward the dark line of trees before answering. "Because I was building a company," he said first. "That's the practical answer." "And the true one?" He turned back to her. "The true one is that after you, I never felt in a hurry to get it wrong." The night seemed to hold still around them. Amara looked away. Not because she wanted to reject the sentence, but because receiving it intact felt almost too intimate. Before she could respond, David said gently, "You don't have to say anything. I'm not asking for anything tonight." She nodded. That was part of what made his presence dangerous. He never demanded. He simply made honesty possible. Days passed, then weeks. The divorce proceedings began faster than Amara expected. Public humiliation had a way of hurrying paperwork when reputation needed cleaning. Kelechi wanted a controlled separation, minimal noise, quick signatures. He called twice. She refused both calls. Their lawyers spoke. Documents moved. Amara returned to work. Children still needed books. Teachers still needed supplies. Communities still needed wells repaired and girls kept in school. Pain did not cancel purpose. It only changed the way you carried it. At home, she slept unevenly. Some nights she woke angry. Some nights ashamed that she had tolerated so much distance before the final insult. Some nights she lay in bed, remembering the exact faces of people in that ballroom, and wondered which humiliation stung more. What Kelechi did, or the fact that others saw it. And yet, under all of that, another current had begun. David called occasionally, never excessively. Sometimes to ask a real question about an education proposal. Sometimes to send her an article. Sometimes only to say, "I'm near your office. Have you eaten?" They had dinner twice more. Then again. The ease between them did not return all at once. Ease never returns all at once when time has passed and damage has been done elsewhere. But trust began to grow again in the old way. Conversation by conversation. Silence by silence. Truth by truth. One Thursday evening, they sat on the terrace of a quiet restaurant while the city rolled and sparkled below them. Amara told him something she had not told anyone else. "I once drafted a plan for my own organization," she said. 3 years ago. David turned toward her fully. "What kind of organization?" community learning hubs. Not just libraries, places where reading, digital access, after-school support, and women's training can happen in the same building. Somewhere children can grow and adults can return without shame. He watched her face as she spoke. That old, attentive stillness came over him. "The plan is good," she said. "I know it is. But every time I got close to doing something with it, I convinced myself it was not the right time." "Was it not the right time?" David asked. "Or were you afraid?" Amara looked down at her glass. "Both." David leaned back slightly. "What would it take?" She laughed once. "That question is bigger than the evening. I didn't ask for a small answer." So she told him. Seed funding, legal structure, a pilot location, a small leadership team, partnership with local schools, protection from bureaucratic sabotage, and courage, though she did not say that last word aloud. David listened to every piece. Then he said, "Write it again." Amara frowned slightly. "What?" "The proposal. Update it. Sharpen it. If it still says what you want it to say, bring it to me." She looked at him carefully. "David, I'm not asking you to rescue me." His expression did not change. "Good," he said. "I'm not interested in rescuing you. I'm interested in backing something worth building." If you like my video, please subscribe my YouTube channel. She went home that night and opened the old file. It had been buried in a folder on her laptop under a practical, forgettable name, as if she had hidden it from disappointment by disguising it as admin work. When she clicked it open, the first draft stared back at her like an earlier version of courage. She read every page. Some of it was outdated. Some of it was too cautious. Some of it, she realized, had been edited down not for clarity, but for permission. Softened into something more acceptable so no one would accuse her of wanting too much. She deleted half of it. Then she began again. For 6 nights, she worked after dinner. She rebuilt the proposal from the inside out, not as an employee imagining what might impress donors, as a founder imagining what must actually exist. She named it the Lantern House Initiative, because that was what she wanted the centers to be. Not charity shelves, not pity spaces. Light. By the time she finished, the document was stronger than the woman who first wrote it. Or perhaps it simply matched the woman she had become. She sent it to David at 1:14 a.m. with a message that read, "If you are too busy, I understand." His reply came at 1:19. "I'm not asleep." The next evening he called. "Do not apologize for wanting this," he said by way of greeting. Amara sat down slowly on the edge of her couch. That is not feedback. It's the most important feedback. Then his tone shifted into practical focus. He had read every page. He had comments, questions, suggestions on rollout, governance, capital structure, and location strategy. He liked that her model did not depend on endless fundraising. He liked that she had built dignity into the design. He liked that she understood the difference between helping people and making them perform gratitude for being helped. He paused. "Amara." "Yes?" "This is real." She closed her eyes. For a long moment, she could not answer. Because some validations heal places apologies never reach. A month after the award night disaster, David invited her to another event. This one was public. A national philanthropy forum in Abuja, where infrastructure investors, social entrepreneurs, governor's aides, and media houses gathered to discuss Africa's human capital future. A phrase so polished it almost hid the fact that what they were really discussing was whether enough powerful people cared to fund what poor communities already knew they needed. David was speaking on a panel. He asked Amara to attend as his guest. She hesitated, not because she feared the room, because she had learned that rooms contained history. Still, she agreed. The forum was held in a modern glass convention center with metal detectors at the entrance, heavy air conditioning, and banners large enough to remind everyone that influence had sponsors. Men in tailored suits moved in clusters. Women in elegant dresses and sharply cut blazers spoke with the assurance of people accustomed to making decisions, or at least standing near those who did. Amara wore cream and bronze. Simple. Strong. When she entered beside David, heads turned. Some because he had arrived. Some because he had not arrived alone. He did not hurry her. He did not possessively guide her. He simply walked beside her as though her place there required no explanation. Midway through the afternoon, after a panel on educational access, David took the stage for a special foundation announcement. Amara expected the usual: pledges, partnerships, pleasant speeches. Instead, halfway through his remarks, David said, "The most effective ideas often come from people who have had to stand closest to the consequences of failure. We like to fund polished language. We should be funding lived intelligence." He looked toward the audience. Then he said her name. "Amara Okafor, would you join me?" 100 faces turned. Amara felt the room tilt. She walked to the stage. David handed her the microphone, not as a prop, as a transfer of trust. "We are launching a pilot partnership," he said, "to establish the first 3 Lantern House community learning hubs. Amara Okafor developed this model. She will lead the initiative." The applause that followed was immediate and real. Amara stood in the bright conference light, hearing her own name spoken, not with pity, not with gossip, not attached to a husband's ambition or a scandal's echo, but attached to work, meaningful work. Camera flashes burst. A journalist in the second row leaned toward another and whispered something while looking at the printed briefing David's team had distributed. Trustees clapped. A commissioner nodded thoughtfully. 2 young women at the back smiled at each other in that special way women do when they see another woman publicly named for something she actually built. Amara spoke briefly. She thanked the foundation. She spoke about access, dignity, local ownership, and why communities should not have to perform hopelessness to deserve resources. When she finished, the applause rose again. And somewhere in the room, a business reporter updated a headline. That evening, the announcement spread quickly. Articles, photos, LinkedIn posts, industry chatter. By morning, several people who had witnessed Kelechi's performance at the Harbor Crown Hotel had also seen images of Amara standing beside David Adebayo under clean white conference lights, holding a microphone as a founder. The city was beginning to revise its understanding of her. Kelechi was not among the first to know. He was among the first to feel it. At first, he heard the news casually. A colleague mentioned it over coffee. "Interesting development," the man said. "Your former wife is leading some initiative with Adebayo Foundation, apparently." Strong woman. Former wife, apparently. Strong woman. Words that landed harder than they should have. Kelechi smiled too slowly and said something dismissive about small nonprofit circles. But later, in his office, he searched for the coverage himself. There she was. Amara, standing with David Adebayo, composed, sharp, alive in a way he had not seen in years, perhaps because he had stopped looking long before she changed. He clicked another article, then another. In one photograph, David was turned slightly toward her, listening while she spoke. Not interrupting, not claiming, listening. Kelechi leaned back in his chair and felt an emotion he refused to call jealousy, because jealousy would have required self-awareness. He called it irritation, then distraction, then concern. But what sat in his chest was simpler. Loss. Not noble loss, possessive loss. The offended shock of a man discovering that the person he reduced in private has become visible in public without his permission. Things at home with Sade were already not going as planned. Affairs live well on fantasy and poor on routine. Sade was brilliant, yes. Stylish, yes. Sharp, yes. But she was not interested in being absorbed into his life quietly. She had expectations, visibility, travel, decisions, space. She disliked compromise when she felt it inconvenienced her. She did not soothe. She did not adapt. She did not spend energy making his world easier unless she benefited clearly from the effort. These were not flaws, exactly. They were simply facts. Kelechi had never bothered to imagine while turning her into escape. And unlike Amara, Sade did not believe in protecting him from himself. "If you are going to keep checking articles about your ex-wife," she said one night over dinner, "at least don't do it in front of me." Kelechi looked up sharply. "I'm not checking articles." Sade laughed once. "Then your face has developed a new hobby." The argument that followed lasted 40 minutes and solved nothing. That same week, Amara signed the first incorporation documents for Lantern House. When she held the papers in her hand, she felt no cinematic rush, no swelling soundtrack, no perfect closure. Just weight. Good weight. Necessary weight. The kind that comes with choosing a life and then admitting you will have to build it. She and David still moved carefully around each other. There were dinners, site visits, meetings, long conversations in cars after events. There were also silences that held history without forcing it to speak before it was ready. Nothing between them was casual, but neither was it rushed. They had both become old enough to distrust speed where feeling was concerned. One Saturday, after visiting a possible pilot site in Ogun State, they stopped by the roadside to buy roasted plantain from a woman working beneath a patched umbrella. The sun was lowering. Dust floated golden in the air. Amara took the paper-wrapped plantain and laughed when the pepper nearly defeated her. David handed her water. "You still eat like you're trying to prove bravery," he said. "And you still observe too much," she answered. He smiled. Then, after a quiet moment, he asked, "Can I tell you something honestly?" "You usually do." "I was angry with you for a long time." She looked at him carefully. "I know," she said. "No, you knew I was hurt. That isn't the same thing." He leaned one shoulder against the SUV and looked out toward the road. "I understood why people leave. Ambition, fear, timing, family pressure. But I didn't understand why you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. That part stayed with me." Amara held the water bottle between both hands. The late sunlight made everything gentler than the conversation felt. "I didn't trust myself enough," she said at last. "It was easier to call it sacrifice than say, I was afraid I wouldn't be enough for the life you were moving toward." David turned toward her slowly. "Amara, you should have let me decide what was enough for me." A foolish, painful laugh rose in her throat. "I know that now." He did not rush to comfort her. That was one of the things she loved most about him, then and now. He never treated the truth like a fragile object needing immediate decoration. He let it stand. After a while, he said, "I would have chosen you." Her eyes stung unexpectedly. They stood there in the roadside dust, with paper-wrapped plantain and too much unsaid history between them. Then David added, gently, "I'm not punishing you for the past. I'm just refusing to pretend it did not exist." Amara nodded. "That's fair." He studied her face for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm glad you're here anyway." The first Lantern House Center opened 6 months later in a neighborhood where children once did homework by the light from phone screens and shop fronts because home power was unreliable and quiet places were rare. The building had once been an abandoned municipal office with broken windows, stained walls, and a roof that sagged in one corner. Now it held shelves, desks, solar backup, reading corners, teacher support rooms, and a small computer lab. On opening day, mothers came in wrappers and good sandals. Fathers stood a little apart, trying to look less proud than they were. Children rushed the shelves with the reverence of people discovering something they had wanted before they knew its exact name. Amara moved through the center, greeting people, answering questions, adjusting chairs, lifting boxes, laughing with the volunteers who insisted she sit down and kept ignoring the fact that she refused. David arrived late because a flight delay had trapped him in Abuja for half the morning. When he walked in, dusty from travel and still half on the phone, children barely noticed him. They noticed Amara. That pleased him more than any reception ever could. He found her in the back room, labeling supplies. "You built it," he said quietly. She looked around at the shelves, the light, the painted walls, the stack of donated readers near the desk. "No," she said. "We built it." David shook his head slightly. "No, I backed it. You built it." Amara looked at him then, in the stillness between tasks. Sometimes love does not return as thunder. Sometimes it returns as recognition, as someone seeing clearly what is yours and refusing to stand in front of it for attention. That evening, after the crowd had thinned, a local journalist interviewed Amara on camera. "What would you say to women who feel their lives are over because something they trusted fell apart?" he asked. Amara smiled faintly. Then she answered, "I would say endings are often rude. They rarely arrive with dignity. But your life does not become smaller just because someone else failed to value it. Sometimes a door closes in public so you can stop knocking on the wrong house in private." The clip spread online. People quoted it, shared it, saved it. Kelechi watched it alone in his apartment after Sade had already left for the evening, angry over yet another argument he no longer had the energy to win. He replayed the video twice. Amara looked different, not because she was more beautiful, though she was, but because she seemed internally arranged. Her voice no longer leaned toward approval. Her face no longer carried the subtle waiting he used to mistake for softness. He thought of their marriage then, with a kind of clarity that punishment sometimes brings too late. The meals she made without announcement, the names she remembered for him, the advice she gave when he pretended to think aloud but was really asking for help. The way she had steadied his anger in early career years. The way she listened before answering. The way she made rooms easier, homes warmer, problems smaller. He had mistaken consistency for ordinariness. This is a common error among the selfish. They think what stays has no value because it stays. By the time they understand, staying is gone. A month later, the divorce was finalized. Amara signed the last document in a lawyer's office with sunlight on the desk and a cup of untouched tea cooling by her elbow. She expected sorrow, or triumph, or rage. Instead, she felt release. Not dramatic, clean, like a rope being cut. When she stepped outside, she lifted her face to the afternoon light and realized that for the first time in years, she did not feel watched inside her own life. She called her mother. "It's done," she said. Her mother was quiet for a second. Then she replied, "Good. Now fill the space with something worthy." Mothers, Amara thought, had a way of turning closure into instruction. She laughed. "I'm trying." "I know," her mother said. "That is why I am no longer worried." By then, David had become woven into her days so naturally that Amara could no longer pretend he occupied some neutral category. He still called before arriving, still asked rather than assumed, still treated her ambition as fact rather than decoration, still remembered details others overlooked. But now there were other things too. His hand at her back in crowded rooms, light and respectful. His eyes finding her first after finishing a speech. The way he relaxed visibly only when they were in the same car at the end of a long day. The quiet certainty between them grew not from declarations, but from repetition. Presence, reliability, shared work, shared laughter, shared silence that did not need repair. One evening, nearly 8 months after the night at Harbor Crown Hotel, they stood on the rooftop terrace of David's office building. The city stretched below in layers of gold, red brake lights, church signs, illuminated billboards, and distant neighborhoods swallowing dusk. The air smelled faintly of rain and diesel and sea breeze. Somewhere down the road, a muezzin's call threaded through traffic noise. Lagos was never one thing. It was 10,000 sounds negotiating survival at once. Amara leaned against the railing and looked out over it all. Behind them, inside the conference room, David's team was still clearing away presentation boards from a strategy meeting on scaling Lantern House to 3 more states. 3 more states. Sometimes, even now, the reality of her life startled her. David stepped beside her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Still too much sugar?" he asked. She took one. "Always." He smiled. For several minutes they said nothing. The city spoke enough. Then David turned toward her. "Amara?" Something in the way he said her name made her heartbeat change. She looked at him. There was no audience, no event host, no cameras, no expensive room waiting to interpret them. Only evening, sky, steam rising from 2 mugs, and the long road that had somehow curved back toward this moment. "I have tried," David said carefully, "to be patient with what time needed to fix, and with what trust needed to relearn. I don't regret that. I would wait longer if I had to." Amara did not breathe. "But I don't want to keep speaking around what is true," he went on. "I love you. I think I never stopped. And I'm not asking because I pity what happened to you, or because I enjoy how life surprised both of us, or because proximity makes people sentimental. I'm asking because when I look at the future now, the part that feels most honest includes you. The city seemed very far away all at once. Amara lowered her mug slowly. Her eyes filled, not with the grief she had spent months surviving, but with something gentler and more dangerous. To be loved after humiliation is one kind of mercy. To be loved accurately is another. She stepped closer. "Do you know what frightened me most the first time?" she asked. David waited. "That being beside you would require me to become more than I believed I was." He looked at her with that quiet focus she had carried in memory for years. "And now?" Amara smiled through tears. "Now I think the right love does not shrink when you grow. It asks you to." David's face changed then. That rare, unguarded softness she had once known by heart. "So," he said, voice lower now, "is that a yes?" She laughed, cried, and nodded all at once. "Yes." He set his mug aside. Then, slowly enough to give her time to refuse, and surely enough to make clear he hoped she would not, he touched her face. When he kissed her, it felt nothing like returning to the past. It felt like arriving somewhere the past had only prepared them to recognize. Below them, the city blazed on. Cars moved. People bargained. Families ate. Generators shook. Children revised for exams under yellow bulbs. Lovers quarreled. Vendors packed up. Night workers began. And above all of it, on a rooftop washed in dusk, Amara stood in a life she had once been too afraid to want. Kelechi heard of their relationship not from gossip, but from a magazine profile. David Adebayo and education founder Amara Okafor were photographed at the opening of the Second Lantern House Center, standing beside schoolchildren holding library cards. The article was mostly about infrastructure, literacy, and scalable social investment. But the photograph said enough. Kelechi stared at it for a long time. Said, reading over his shoulder, asked, "Are you going to keep punishing yourself with that? Or are you finally going to admit you made a catastrophic mistake?" He turned sharply. "Why are you still here if you think that?" Said closed the magazine and set it on the table. "Because mistakes are educational," she said coolly. "And I wanted to see whether you would learn anything from yours." Then she picked up her bag and left. He did not stop her. There are some losses that announce themselves with a slammed door. Others simply confirm what has already been dying in the room. Months later, on the first anniversary of the night Kelechi ended his marriage with a microphone, Lantern House hosted a donors' evening in a renovated cultural center with open courtyards, live high-life music, and walls hung with photographs of children reading, coding, painting, and laughing beneath solar lights. Amara moved through the event wearing ivory and gold. Not because she needed to prove anything, because joy suited her now. David stood nearby in conversation with a governor's aide and a journalist, but his eyes kept finding her between exchanges, returning as naturally as breathing. At one point, a young volunteer asked Amara, "Ma'am, do you ever think about what would have happened if that terrible night had never happened?" Amara considered the question. Then she answered with the honesty age had finally given her. "Yes," she said. "Sometimes. But not with longing." The volunteer waited. Amara looked across the courtyard to where David was laughing at something a little girl had said while tugging his sleeve. Then she said, "Some roads break under you because they were never built to carry your future. It doesn't mean the fall was fair. It only means you were not meant to build there." Later, when the speeches were done and the guests had begun to leave, Amara stood before the small remaining crowd to give closing remarks. She thanked the partners. She thanked the communities. She thanked the teachers and volunteers. Then she paused. The courtyard quieted. A year ago, silence in a room had meant humiliation. Now, silence meant attention she had earned. She looked around at the lanterns hanging in the trees, the children's drawings on the far wall, the women from local cooperatives seated in front, the donors who had finally understood that dignity was not a side issue, but the entire foundation of useful work. Then she spoke. "A year ago, I thought my life had ended in a room where someone else tried to define me by what he no longer wanted," she said. "I know now that no one gets to name your worth after failing to recognize it. Rejection is not a verdict. Public embarrassment is not prophecy. And the life waiting for you after betrayal may be the first life that actually fits." The crowd was still. Some people were crying quietly. Amara smiled. "Thank you for believing in Lantern House. Thank you for believing in children who deserve more than survival. And thank you for proving, with us, that restoration is not a slogan. It is work." The applause rose slowly, then fully. David was the last to stop clapping. After the guests had gone, the staff stacked chairs and folded linens. Music faded. The city deepened into night. Amara and David remained in the courtyard beneath the lanterns, no longer surrounded by expectation, only by the afterglow of something built honestly. David reached for her hand. She let him. "How does it feel?" he asked. Amara looked around, at the lights, at the walls, at the evidence, at her own life. Then she answered with the simplest truth she knew. "It feels like I finally stopped apologizing for taking up the space meant for me." David smiled. "Good." She squeezed his hand once. Above them, the lanterns moved gently in the night breeze. Ahead of them, work remained. Expansion, negotiations, communities to reach, policies to survive. Long days, hard choices. Growth, love, maintenance, real life. But none of it frightened her the way smallness once had. Because she knew now what many people spend decades learning too late. The worst room you ever cry in may still be the doorway to the best life you ever build. And the person who walks away from you in arrogance may only be clearing the road for those with eyes to see your value properly. If you like my video, please subscribe my YouTube channel.